right, open up your Bibles to Paul's letter to Titus, if you would please. We'll be looking at that letter, beginning a study of that letter this evening. And I want to begin, if I can get that to work. Oops, too far. I want to begin with, who is Titus? Who is Titus? You know, in the New Testament, we have he is almost an unknown soldier. We know very little about Titus. Paul called him in 2 Corinthians chapter 8, my partner and fellow worker. But there's no mention of him in the book of Acts in connection with Paul's work. William Ramsey's called him the most enigmatic figure in early Christian history. And the letter written to him is also kind of relatively unknown. It's kind of tucked away between 2 Timothy and Philemon. We don't sometimes think too much about it. We kind of gloss over it, gets lost in the shadows, you could say. But when you take a close look at it, as we will be doing in this study, we'll see that it contains more specific information for different groups of people regarding how to live as Christians than any other letter. It's very condensed, though brief, but it's packed with a lot of information. And Paul addresses this letter to this Titus, his true child, he says, in a common faith. So who is he? And the information about him, it's limited. We know very little of this, of him, but what we do know is impressive. Open your Bibles. I know I said to turn to Titus, I apologize. Look, let's actually start over in Galatians. If you would, turn over to Galatians chapter 2. We're going to look at just a couple of verses there, not much, but I want you to see it. Over here, we're not sure everything that is happening with this Titus. We know that he was a Greek, chapter 2, verse 3. Not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. And Paul called Titus his true child in that common faith, suggesting that he baptized him and taught him, although we can't know that for certain. We know that he picked him up in the city of Antioch. Maybe he lived there. Again, that's something we're not sure of. There's so little we know about him. It could have been from another city. But at some point, Titus became a traveling companion of Paul. We see all throughout 2 Corinthians where he was being sent and he was traveling along with Paul. And it raises the question again, why didn't Luke mention Titus at all in the book of Acts? I mean, in our studies of the 2 Corinthian letter and the other letters, we know he's there. He's with Paul quite a bit. And he even went, as we'll see here in a little bit, down all the way to the Jerusalem conference as Exhibit A about why you don't have to be circumcised. So why, when Luke was there and commenting about the things happening at the Jerusalem conference, he doesn't ever mention Titus? He mentions Timothy, he mentions Silas, he mentions himself and others, but never Titus. We don't know. Some have speculated that maybe Titus was a brother of Luke. But we don't know that. There's no way to know. But they say, well, maybe Luke was being humble and not wanting to mention that this was his brother working alongside Paul here. And so there's a lot of interesting things that we just don't know about this young man. And of course, when we are discussing him, we naturally make a comparison of him to Timothy. Timothy they both were converted by Paul. But Titus may have been a bit older. You may remember from 1 Timothy chapter 4, he told Timothy, let no one look down upon your youthfulness. We don't see that happening with Titus, although he is told to be an example to the young men there in Titus 2, 6 through 8. Also, it looks like Titus doesn't have any health problems that was suffered by Timothy. And one preacher has characterized them as timid Timothy and tough Titus. Tough Titus. And the reason why he's tough Titus is because some people call him Paul's troubleshooter. We'll see that every situation where it arises that he is there or sent somewhere is because of a very intense situation or a difficulty that he is sent to either look into or help fix. And so he is the one sent out. Rather than Timothy or one of the others, Paul sends Titus. And we read about one such situation here in Galatians chapter 2. These Judaizing teachers from Jerusalem were proclaiming that it was necessary to circumcise Gentiles and to direct them to observe the law of Moses. That's from Acts 15, Galatians 2:4 as well. And this was, of course, a crucial moment in the church, as we've discussed in the past, that this is, I think, Satan trying his best to divide the church. It was growing, and he was trying to create a Gentile church that would be meeting there in Antioch, and then the Jewish church out of Jerusalem. Paul recognized the issue in the split that was just almost seemed like organically happening, and so he got all the Gentiles to start putting funds together, and he was going to take that down to give to the needy Jews that were suffering in the famine. But there was also other issues with the circumcision and other things that were dividing the church, and Paul was stressed and worried that he had been running in vain. Not that he was teaching wrong, but he was worried that when he got down to Jerusalem, he was going to find out that the apostles were teaching things that were contrary to the teachings of Christ. And I think he had that worry as well. And the Jerusalem conference helped clear all that up. But he also brought Titus as our exhibit A of a Gentile Christian who did not need circumcision or any other Jewish rite to be valued as a member of God's church. So look there at chapter 2, verse 1 of Galatians. Then after an interval of 14 years, I went up again to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along also. It was because of a revelation that I went up, and I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running or had run in vain. But not even Titus, who was with me, though he was a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. But it was because of the false brethren secretly brought in, who had sneaked in to spy out our liberty, which we have in Christ Jesus, in order to bring us into bondage. But we did not yield in subjection to them for even an hour, so that the truth of the gospel would remain with you. And when we read this, I think it's hard for us to put our minds around just how intense this situation was. When the Jews disagreed with Jesus, how tense would those situations get? How angry would they get or upset they would become? Quite a bit. And when the Jews would disagree with the religious comments that Paul was making, what would they do to him? They'd run him out of the town, or they would stone him. They would be very angry. And so now, here is another tense situation where it says Titus was not even compelled to be circumcised. And they were, what does that say there in verse 4? Make sure I say it right. But we did not yield in subjection to them even for an hour. Why not just say we didn't yield in subjection to them? But he just said not even for an hour. So it sounds like this debate went on and on and on. And Titus was there. Could you imagine being Titus and being scrutinized by these guys? Maybe even being compelled to get circumcised? You'd have to have a tough skin, and you have to really know where you stand in Christ. And he did. He was tough. And this wasn't the first, this wasn't the only thing that he had done that showed that he had the gumption, the strength to really push forward. Talking about somebody who had the spirit of Paul in him. So we can only imagine what it was like for him to have to go through all these things and yet not compelled to be circumcised. Another tension-filled environment which required strong leadership was old Corinth, where the congregational crisis was at a peak. And who did Paul trust to deal with the difficult and delicate task of checking in on the Corinthian situation? Turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 12. Just one little thing there I want us to look at, and we're going to skip over a couple of chapters here in here. Chapter 12, verse 18. This is toward the end, but he says that I urged Titus to go, and I sent the brother with him. Titus did not take any advantage of you, did he? Did we not conduct ourselves in the same spirit and walk in the same steps? That's just pointing out that he sent him. He urged Titus to go there. And we know about Corinth. That was a wicked city, and that congregation had all kinds of issues. And this is already, or about 2 letters of Paul's had already been written to them before 2 Corinthians, and he sends Titus because Paul was worried about the situation there. Who would you send? About the congregation in whom you had worked so hard and you were stressing out over, who would you send? So Paul was concerned, and he waited for Titus to return. Now turn over to 2 Corinthians chapter 2. Look at verses 12 and 13. 2 Corinthians 2, verse 12. Now when I came to Troas, now he had already sent Titus. Now when I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, and when a door was opened for me in the Lord. Now stop right there for a moment. A door was opened for Paul in the Lord to preach the gospel. That's what he lives for, isn't it? And so that he's pointing out, here's this opportunity, verse 13. I had no rest for my spirit, not finding Titus my brother, but taking my leave of them, I went on to Macedonia. So he had this great opportunity to preach, and he did his best to do it, I'm sure, but there was stress in his heart concerning Titus and the situation at Corinth, and he just couldn't wait any longer. He needed to go. Even though this door of opportunity was presented to him, he wanted to move on to Macedonia to find Titus, to find out what was going on, what had happened there in Corinth. Turn over to chapter 7. Look at verses 5 through 16. Well, we're not going to read 5 through 16. Let's drop down. He's talking about his heavy heart there in verses 1 through 5, verse 6. But God, who comforts the depressed, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort with which he was comforted in you, as he reported to us your longing, your mourning, your zeal for me, so that I rejoiced even more. And this whole chapter is about that Paul's heart for the Corinthians, his worry for Titus, and the report he brought back to them. That tells you that Paul was not expecting that. He was expecting it to be far worse. And who did he trust to go and deal with that situation? Titus. Titus. And tough Titus. I often wonder when before we had kids, we were making a list of names. And of course, Jenny likes the J's because we have Joshua, Jonah, Jody, Julie. And I had some names I liked, Joshua and others. I just like all your names, don't worry. But I also liked Benjamin and Titus. I've always liked Titus. What a tough individual, young man he was. And Paul really trusted in him. William Barclay characterized Titus as the kind of co-worker who will go out with you in any kind of weather. He gets the job done. What a good man. Paul valued him highly. He called him his true child in a common faith in Titus, his brother in the family of God, 2 Corinthians 2:13, and his partner and fellow worker in the Lord, 2 Corinthians 8:23. He is mentioned another time over in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 10, where we read that he was in Dalmatia. And this is toward the end of Paul's life. So no doubt, Paul must have sent him out on another difficult task, and he's off doing it. He's out there working hard, and after facing and dealing with the island of Crete. And according to ancient tradition, he returned to Crete in his old age and was buried there at 94. That's just tradition. We're not sure, but it's interesting. All right, back to the where and when of Titus. The opening lines of the letter, Paul says, I left you in Crete. Island of Crete. It's 156 miles across, 8 miles at the small areas there, and then in thickness, and then about 35 miles at the thicker parts of the island. And it is located in the Mediterranean Sea, South Greece and Turkey area. And one of the few references to Crete in the New Testament is in Acts chapter 27. Alex brought this out real well in his series on the book of Acts. Paul had been allowed to, or he was there on that ship going his way to Rome. He was under arrest. They were stopped off at Fair Havens. Now, in another place, at another time, he was allowed to go ashore. And I'm assuming he was allowed to go ashore at Fair Havens as well. And that's probably when he discovered that there were congregations on the island, more than just one. And Paul tells Titus to go throughout all the cities of Crete, appointing elders. So you probably had all kinds of small congregations just strewn all throughout. Imagine if that was your job as a preacher. You had to go 135 miles, bouncing back and forth to all these different congregations in these small cities, dealing with these folks, trying to find spiritual men, appointing elders, and dealing with the problems in every congregation you went to. And he probably had to deal with a lot. But how did these congregations get started? Where did they come from? Well, chances are they popped up when Peter, on the day of Pentecost over in Acts chapter 2, was preaching. The Cretans were there, so they could have brought it back to the island after that. It could have also happened after Acts chapter 8 during the persecution when Paul was still being called Saul, and they were all driven out of Jerusalem. They came back to the island and began to bring the gospel of Christ to the people there as well. And so historically, the Crete island was strategically positioned there in the Mediterranean. It was, at one time, a very popular stopover where it had a great culture. It was growing and it was thriving. But at this point, with Paul and with Titus coming to the island, it was considered a cultural graveyard of a once proud, thriving civilization. And the inhabitants of the island had garnered not a great reputation. As Paul even says that one of their poets calls them, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons. And apparently that description was still applicable to them in the days of Titus. Could you imagine being called up by Paul and told, I got some work for you. I want you to go work with the congregations in Crete. Oh, I've never been to Crete. Paul, can you give me a little rundown? Well, yeah. They're all liars, they're evil beasts, and they're lazy gluttons. Are you ready to go? Well, if you need me to, Paul, I'll go. And Titus goes to the island of Crete. What a situation. How difficult that must have been for him. We would probably classify them, looking at the soils in Luke chapter 8, as rocky soil. But the seed of the word had been planted. Congregations were located all throughout the breadth of the island, and Titus went there, and he worked as hard as he could. And so the congregations of the Lord existed on the island. Most of these were probably small and struggling, and somehow Paul learned of their spiritual needs on the island, and when he was released from house arrest there in Rome, this was one of the places he visited. And when he departed, he left Titus on the island to finish the work. This letter was probably written around the same time of 1 Timothy. I don't have the dates up there, but it's around 60, 65 A.D. So we got the who, the when, where. What about the why and the what? Why did Paul write to Titus? And what is the content of this letter? Well, Paul tells us, if you want to turn back over to Titus, chapter 1, verse 5. Titus chapter 1, verse 5. Paul wrote, "For this reason I left you in Crete, that you would set in order what remains and appoint elders in every city as I directed you." So the appointment of elders is the subject of chapter 1. Chapters 2 and 3 are concerned with other matters that need to be set in order. So Paul probably also wrote to encourage Titus regarding the task that he was faced with and backing him up, giving him an authoritative apostolic letter here. And since Titus is a personal letter, it has a minimum of not much internal organization. It seems like it's thrown together, but there is organization. And you can break it up like this. Chapter 1 focuses on what is lacking in the church. Chapter 2 addresses what is lacking in the home. And chapter 3 relates what is lacking in society. And the following outline that I want to give you is based on the instruction of setting in order what remains. And this is how I'm going to approach the letter this time around. The last time I went through this letter was about 8 years ago. I had a different outline, but I like this one better. Number 1, putting things in order by appointing strong leadership. Men who are strong Christian husbands and fathers should be selected as elders. Men who are able to deal with false teachers should be selected as elders. We see that in chapter 1, also a little bit there in chapter 3. Putting things in order by emphasizing sound or healthy doctrine in chapter 2. You got sound doctrine commanded, how it is applied to all ages and servants. And then he explains that at the end of chapter 2. And then finally, putting things in order by encouraging good deeds in chapter 3. The need for those good deeds as citizens, as evangelists, and then the motive for good deeds, God's love. And I have closing remarks there in verses 12 to 15, but that also includes an opportunity for those on the island of Crete to engage in good deeds. As Paul tells Titus, I'm sending Apollos and Zenas, the lawyer, to you, and make sure they're taken care of. Give them bedding and lodging for the night. Here's an opportunity for them to do a good deed and throw off the reputation that the island has. And so he gives them that ability there in verses 12 through 15. It is a very short letter, as you can see. If you just look at it, a couple of pages. We would probably blow through this pretty easily, but I want us to dive into this text a little bit and remember and think about who Titus is. I think we sometimes gloss over that, or we just kind of imagine him just like Timothy. But I think Timothy is a lot younger than Titus, and he didn't have to deal with the kind of things that Titus had to, and Titus seemed to get the job done. Timothy was over there in Ephesus. He stayed there, and he struggled with the work over there, whereas Titus had a lot of works. He was sent to do a lot of things, and he would finish those things up, get those congregations moving where they could work on their own, and he would move on to another work. And in the end of Paul's life, he's over in Dalmatia, and who knows where else he had gone. He was a worker for the Lord, strong of heart, strong of mind, and everything I see about him tells me that this was someone who had a heart for God. If there was anyone who had a spirit like Paul, it was Titus. And this letter is meant to not only encourage him, but to give him a little bit of authority and backing with those congregations there on the island of Crete, that Paul has got a work for him to do, and they need to let him get that work done and to get that stuff moving along. And it must have worked, because it wasn't too long after this where he would be finishing that up, and he'll be moving on to other works with Paul. So I hope you get to come by on Sunday nights and join us in this study in the book of Titus, and maybe we can learn a little bit about these things. And any questions you have afterward, I'm more than welcome to hear them and address those in this series. So that's the introduction. Next week we're going to start into chapter 1. We probably won't get through the whole chapter, maybe about the first half, but try to be here. And again, any questions you have, I'm more than willing to listen to those. But as we close out this introduction, I know I didn't say or do anything to elicit a response. This is just an introduction, it's the beginning. But with anything, as we always say, let's take off take out our preconceived ideas. Try to read this as if we're doing it for the very first time. Ask yourself questions about the book, like Titus. I bet you many of those things I said this evening about Titus you knew, but have you ever put them all together to see what kind of man he was? Tough guy. Tough. And somebody that Paul really trusted, especially when you think about the situation there in Corinth. And when you think about that Paul took him to the Jerusalem conference. Well, what do you want me to go there for, Paul? You're going to be my exhibit A before the Pharisees. Oh, I don't want to go. But he went. He went. What a strong man. And he always went, didn't he? No matter what. For the cause of Christ, for the building up of the body, to show truth. I hope my kids grow up to be like Titus. What a good man. Things to think about. Let's do that as we stand and sing this closing song.